Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on strategies and partnerships for electric vehicle corridor planning. My name is Cassie Powers, and I'm with the National Association of State Energy Officials, or NASEO. We are delighted to be hosting this webinar with the support of the U.S. Department of Energy's Vehicle Technologies Office, as well as the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, and in partnership with ICF and Atlas Public Policy. This webinar is part of a series of virtual events that we're hosting to share information and best practices with states as they prepare for EV infrastructure build out under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Of course, there's a lot happening in that space right now, and we're all eager to hear the federal guidance coming out of the U.S. Department of Transportation in a few weeks. Today's webinar is going to focus on strategies that states have used during their EV program design process, and is going to continue along our theme of exploring partnerships used to make EV rollout a success. And so with that, I'd like to introduce the presenters on our webinar. First, starting off with Robert Jackson with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, sharing a little bit about the programs in Michigan, some of the models used and partnership strategies. Following Robert will be Leon Ashford with the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality, talking a little bit about EV infrastructure programs in Oklahoma. And finally, with Angela Conroy with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robert to get us started. And Dylan will be pulling up the slides in just a moment. And Robert, I'll turn it to you.
Okay, thank you, Cassie. I want to thank Cassie and NASEO and DOE and Leon and Angela for letting me be part of this the conversation today on mobility issues. In Michigan, we're pretty focused on developing a strategy to expand mobility within the state, and we're doing that throughout all of state government. We're doing it within the Michigan Public Service Commission, within the created Office of Future Mobility Electrification, which is overseeing the implementation of electrification and mobility across the state, and as well as in our Department of Transportation that is working on strategies for improving transportation within the state. What I want to talk about today is our Charge on Michigan program and what we're doing there and how we're building out an EV charging infrastructure to support light duty and medium duty and heavy duty vehicles. And the way that we're approaching it, the next slide, please, is that we're taking a very pragmatic approach, or just like I guess I'd like to say an engineering approach of how we would do it. Our initial approach, which started back in 2019 when we were just received funding through the VW settlement to build this infrastructure, is that we really had three things in mind. And one is that we were going to build with the VW funds a DC fast charging network and integrate into the network planning some level 2 charging network to support 2 million EVs or 2 million trips that we were seeing across Michigan on Michigan roads. The second was to lower the GHG emissions from light duty, medium duty vehicles. And third, really, I think is the more important, is that in order to increase the adoption of EVs, we needed to ensure that we could provide worry-free EV travels throughout Michigan by the year 2040. Next slide, please. Now, currently, what we're looking at is this: we're still trying to incentivize public and private investment in building this charging network, but we're also doing it to support, the transportation and mobility priorities that are articulated within the governor's My Healthy Climate Plan. And then there we're looking at incentivizing or increasing the adoption of the purchase of electric vehicles, encouraging the public and private sectors to increase the transition to the EVs in their fleets, develop clean fuel standards, broaden our transportation planning, and to begin to develop transit and target solutions for mobility and security. Next slide, please. And so to do that, we needed to think very strategically and holistically about how we were going to do it. And we enlisted the aids of utilities and the automobile manufacturers, the private sector, state agencies, NGOs, really to come together to look at building out this EV charging network and to address really, the four critical questions. Those were, one, where were we going to deploy the charging stations? The second was how many charging outlets that we needed to build within Michigan, and what would be the approximate cost of the investment. And then I think the fourth was probably the most important, is that how are we going to pay for this? Because in order for this to be sustained, in order for us to sustain the development in the build out of an infrastructure, it's really necessary for us to pay for it all at one time. And at that time, the only funding that was available was the VW settlement. Next slide, please. So in our approach and having these conversations with the utilities, the investment-owned utilities, the co-ops, the munis, we wanted to get a sense of what was the state of the charging infrastructure within their service territory. So we started to begin to collect data sets, and we were working with our main partner, Michigan State University, and the staff there to begin to do that analysis. In particular, Dr. Ganani, she and her staff were very important in terms of helping us think through what data sets that we needed in order to do the analysis. So one of them was to gather information from utilities. The second, we know that as we built out this network, that it was going to be not only just for corridor charging transportation, but we needed to think holistically and include in there tourism too, looking at the locations of national parks, state parks, and the other tourist attractions that we needed to think about and plan for as we began to build the strategy and build out the network, excuse me. And then we started to have, conversations with the charging equipment companies and looking at, what is the current infrastructure that is out there within the state, especially in regards to level 3 or DC fast charging, how many chargers that we had. And then we began to look at, or we had thought we could look at, the lodging information, hotels, motels, Airbnbs, but we didn't include that in our first analysis, but we will include it in future analysis, and I'll get to that at the end. And then we looked at travel demand, which I think is probably the most critical thing about this whole thing, is we needed to know where traffic patterns were within the state, how folks were driving vehicles, and the intensity of trips that were being taken on a daily and monthly basis. And then lastly, we were looking at what is the cost of charging, what is the current rates out there, and what is the cost of charging equipment, matter of fact, and what were the technologies that were currently on the market when we were looking at in 2019, and what would they be, over time, because we were thinking that as we built this, technology would get better, and batteries would increase in terms of capacity and their ability to store charge to allow further distance and further driving. And so as I said, we worked with Michigan State University, and they developed an algorithm or modeling for us to do. Next slide, please. And this is just part of that model algorithm that they developed for us. And I'm not going to get into what this all means, but it's part of a computer simulation that they were able to develop on our behalf, and we have vetted it through national labs, and this has been academically reviewed. So we feel very comfortable on the model itself and the process and the algorithm that was used and considered in order to do the analysis. So next slide, please. Which kind of led us to how we would start this whole project. And again, we decided that we would do kind of a simple road reference network data that was given to us by a number of sources, in particular from our Department of Transportation, in order to do this modeling. So we use the simplified reference network as the backbone or the layer that we would build and build on in terms of placement of charging stations across the state. One of the other things that we needed to know is was how many trips that were being taken in an electric vehicle throughout the year. Next slide, please. And then we received some data from our Department of Transportation, which informed us as to the number of trips that were being counted on Michigan roads over a course of over a year and on a monthly basis. Our initial thought was that, well, okay, there was going to be inconsistencies The number of chips that we were going to be counting, that our Department of Transportation would count, was going to vary a lot. And as you look at this graph, it's pretty consistent. You know, it's around 3 million vehicles that are being counted on the roads on average per day and per month, and there's consistency throughout. And so we felt very comfortable that we didn't have to plan for a charging network to address seasonal variations in travel. That based upon this, we needed to address one system that would address both winter and summer driving. And as we began to do the modeling work, we decided that we would just model for the winter, because that's where we have the greatest degradation in batteries. If you own an EV, you kind of know that in cold weather climates, you lose a significant amount of your charge within your vehicle, unless you own a Tesla, where the charging is kind of optimized as you go, but the other vehicles is not. So in using the data that we received, and also verifying it, if you look at the next slide here, verifying it, if you could start the simulation, we were looking at the simulation of how traffic was moving throughout the state on a daily basis. And what you see here is a depiction of the traffic patterns over a course of 24 hours in Michigan. And as you can see it, the majority of the traffic the intensity of the traffic that is in Michigan is really occurring in Southeast Michigan, or in the lower portion of the state. And there is travel that needs to be accounted for up in the Upper Peninsula, because that's a very important corridor for us. But we know that as we begin to prioritize the rollout of the charging stations, that our focus needs to be really on the Southeast Michigan, or lower portion of the state, and that's where the greatest amount of investment is going to be. So next slide, please. So what you see here is the recommendations of what we looked at. We looked at a couple of scenarios. We looked at a low-tech scenario where what would be the need if the charging technology was very, didn't rapidly improve over time, meaning that we were seeing that at the time when we started the analysis, 50 kW chargers as being really top of the line. But we knew that there were, if we can get in 2040 or 2030, 2040, the technology, there would probably be chargers that are out there that are 150 kW, which we know. And then we were looking at the batteries, and looking at the battery size that is what considered to be high end in 2019, 2020 in our conversations with the autos. They were 70 kilowatt hour batteries. That was pretty much the high end, and we knew that by 2030, 2040, that the battery technology would improve, and we could probably get to a high end technology of 100 kilowatt hours. And as we ran the analysis and we began to look at the placement of the charging stations, it became clear to us that we needed to look at a mixed technology, because we knew that in the year 2030, 2040, there'll still be older vehicles on the road, but most of those vehicles that are on the road are going to be high capacity. Those vehicles are going to have high capacity batteries, and that 70 planning for 70 kilowatt hour battery electric vehicle seems reasonable. And a 50 kilowatt charger was reasonable. Even if you were to put 275s in parallel, it would get you to the 150, and that seems reasonable to us. So that's that's what our plan follows that recommendation from the model. Now, I need to stress that we're building a bare bone. Our intent was to build a bare bone system. So the number of charging stations that you see here, in terms of the low tech, the mixed tech, and the high tech technologies, that are all different. But we did settle on the mixed tech, which means that we were looking at designing a system that would offer 150 kilowatts of charge to 75 chargers, and that would constitute a station. And we would be charging a vehicle with 70 kilowatt hour capacity. So the number of charging stations that we would need would be 700 across the state. Again, this all assumes that the driver charges their vehicle prior to departing on their trip. And we know that there are use cases or situations where this is not possible. But when we ran this model, this was the outcome. So 700 stations with a total of 1,400 chargers. Now, this is in addition to the number of charging stations that were currently out in the state and the number of chargers that were out there. So next slide, please. So when you look at the depiction of the network and you see all the green denotes where there should be a charging station. Purple and the other colors denote the chargers that we're building out. And we've currently have built out or have commitments for 125 chargers, and there's a number of chargers that are in the queue. But we believe that we could hit that model, that number of charging stations within our time frame. The thing that I guess that I want to point out is that when we were looking at, as I said, when we were looking at building a network, it was all based upon how do we finance this? And the approach that we're taking the 1/3 model. So if you look at the charging stations, the 700 charging stations, and the number of chargers that we need to support those charging stations across the state, in looking at it from an average cost and working with the charging equipment companies, and we're using a figure of $170,000 on average for two 75 kilowatt chargers, with the make ready cost and the all in, our investment cost is around $51 million. And now currently, with what we've invested $15 million, but we have, again, with the 1/3 ratio, the 50 million, 51 million to cover the cost of these 700 charging stations at 75 kilowatt hours. Well, two 75 kilowatt chargers constitute a station. I want to make sure I get that out. And so as we look at our next steps and what we want to do, we know that we can afford this network, but our goal is really to support greater traffic or greater volume of electric vehicles being on the road in the future. And so we need to triple that, or even quadruple it, and get so a significant number of chargers out there. And so as we're beginning to move forward, and if you can go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about what those plans are. So in those plans, we need to roll out additional chargers, and we believe that the funding that we're getting from the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act will allow us to roll it out. And our new goal is we need to get 10,000 DC fast chargers deployed across Michigan, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 90,000 level 2 chargers. That is our goal. That is our plan. We're going to get that done to meet the governor's My Healthy Climate Plan. And so we're doing it in phases. We have an ongoing phase now where we're doing Charge Up Michigan, and we're still rolling out our in the deployment of charging stations. We're working with Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, to roll out what they call the Lake Michigan Charging Circuit, where we're going to place charging stations around the Lake Michigan coastline. We're also doing some additional storage. We're doing some additional projects looking at EV charging with storage and solar. We've done a feasibility study. We know that there are certain areas within utilities networks where it can't support DC fast charging, or the cost of charging needs to be supplemented. And so we think we can drive down that cost of charging by employing or integrating storage into it. But in order for storage to work, we need to use second life batteries. And so we have a project now that we're looking at demonstrating the applicability or the use of second life batteries as a means of storage with solar. And we're looking at the charge, discharge, and recharging rate to see how the batteries perform over time. The next thing that we're also doing is that we're in the process. We will be working with our Department of Transportation and Office of Future Mobility and Electrification, really is to demonstrate wireless charging, the feasibility of it for heavy duty vehicles in certain locations around the state. We have selected, or our Department of Transportation has selected, a vendor, and they'll maybe making an announcement fairly soon, but that is the plan, along with doing some additional work on modeling work on our EV hiving corridor placement model phase 2. We plan to commence that during the summer, where we will be looking at gaps in our system and trying to deploy charging stations to fill those gaps. And then we'll be doing the same thing for doing the phase 2 of our EV charging station urban placement model. We're going to just kick that off in the fall, where we'll look at communities around the state where we see the greater demand for charging need, as well as the need for placing level 2 or the 50 kilowatt chargers as a means of supplementing the level 2 chargers around multifamily dwellings. So that is what we're doing in Michigan in terms of how we're going to approach it. We're taking a holistic approach. And I've only talked about, Charge Up Michigan, but we, as I said before, we have a Office of Future Mobility and Electrification that is looking more broader and putting together a strategic plan or a master plan for how we will move into an area of mobility and autonomous vehicle driving across the state, and doing so safely and prudently and efficiently, and being able to pay for it at the same time. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Cassie.
Thanks very much, Robert. We did have a question that I just wanted to pose, and
Sure.
one of the participants asked how you identified and balanced the need for chargers in areas that the private sector would find attractive, like areas with high demand,
Okay.
and areas that they.
So yes, and so it is a balancing act. So I should explain the part that I didn't say is that it's a 1/3 relationship with utilities and with the state and with the private sector. Each one of the major investment-owned utilities within the state operate their own program, like Power My Drive is with consumers, and there's one through DTE. In the host or the private sector that wants to install the charger applies to those programs, and then we come in as a partner. So we don't really dictate what the type of equipment that gets installed within that service territory, but we do have our requirements. It has to be DC fast charger. It can't be any less than 62.5 kilowatt. And we try to do it in such a way that we basically say that here are the nodes that are out there. You apply for that node. That way we can ensure that we don't have more chargers out there in the network that are just stranded assets. We don't want that to happen. And we also want the private sector who's investing in these charging stations to get cost recovery. So we're very strategic about how we do the evaluation and where we place. You have to be, your site location has to be in accordance with the model, because the model dictates where these charging stations should be, and it dictates the number. And so in return, we give you the opportunity for cost recovery. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Thank you, Robert.
Okay.
We do have a couple more questions, but in the interest of time, we're going to move on to our next speaker. So hopefully we'll be able to come back to these at the end. And so thank you, Robert. Very helpful. And so now we'd like to turn it over to Leon Ashford and for the state of Oklahoma to talk a little bit about their Charge OK program. Leon?
Yes, thank you, Cassie. This is Leon Ashford. I volunteer to work on the Charge OK program for the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality. We were the lead agency for the VW Trust funds. And the first thing we did was develop a team, and we included the Oklahoma Secretary of Energy and Environment's office. We included Oklahoma Department of Transportation and Oklahoma Corporation Commission. And in the state of Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Corporation Commission regulates electric service, so that's the reason why they were there. Next slide, please. Okay, the purpose, we wanted to reduce the nitrogen oxides and particulate matter, and the main thing was to reduce range anxiety for people driving electric vehicles across Oklahoma. So we wanted to build out a light duty electric vehicle charging network. And so we decided to have two concepts to work on. One, transportation corridors, where people travel for the most part, and some single point locations. It's where people are traveling to in the state of Oklahoma. Next slide, please. Okay, it was on a competitive basis for the purchase, installation, and operation of publicly accessible light duty charging stations. Okay, and the maximum amount, our 15% that we were able to use amounted to $3.1 million. So, you know, if you've tried to pay for electric charging stations before, you know that $3.1 million doesn't go too far. So we were trying to be as frugal as possible. In the DEQ, the maximum for the DEQ funds, the maximum that we would reimburse an entity was 80%. When we requested proposals, we made sure in the application that pointed out that the lower the amount of reimbursement you requested, the more points you're going to score for that project. We tried to make sure that people understood that it was a reimbursement and that the work needed to be completed and verified before we would reimburse for that project. And we also gave them 12 months to complete. I would suggest if you're starting this now that it would be a good thing to maybe give them 18 or 24 months to complete a project. Due to chip shortages and other shortage and transportation problems, we have seen an increase in the amount of time it takes to complete a project. We also made sure that they knew that they needed to receive a notice to proceed. If we awarded someone a project, they needed to receive a notice to proceed from us before they proceeded with that project. And the notice to proceed would be sent to them after the contract was basically signed by both parties. Next slide, please. And this is a map of the transportation corridors that we were hoping to have chargers located on in the state of Oklahoma. It kind of took into account what was already there. There were a few chargers. I would like to point out that we started this, we started accepting applications in November of 2018. So we started this some time ago. We took applications from November of 2018 to March of 2019. And one thing I would like to advise people, if you're taking applications over a long period of time, we set 90 days, but even 60 or 30 days, don't be concerned if you're not receiving applications for a while, because almost all of our applications were received within the last 3 days that it was open. And in this charging corridors, we would give people that would score higher points if they had something located along the corridor, although they could apply to put a charging station along any of the state highways. Next slide, please. Okay. We had a submission time. And we had a scoring committee. We had one person from each of the different entities. So there were 4 of us. And the easiest way we found to do it, we got together. Was pre-pandemic, so it was a little bit easier, but we all got together in a room with Google Earth and took a look at each one of the applications and tried to determine the location that they're wanting to put this charger. Does it have access to water? Is it a convenience store? Is it something, say, a business that's going to be open 24 hours a day? Is there access to bathrooms there? Is there some restaurants or places to eat within an easy walking distance? So we scored all the different applications. I believe we probably received twice as many applications that we were able to award. We were very fortunate that we had a company that was very active in the state of Oklahoma that was willing to install. They were wanting to install charging stations, and they were taking advantage of some of the tax credits that were available, federal and state. And so they only requested a 15% reimbursement on some of their different projects. And we found that the cost of the projects could range anywhere from as low as a municipality putting in, installing one themselves, and the total cost of the project being about $60,000 to $70,000 to a private sector company locating a charger. It may be a couple of 200 kW chargers in a location, and they may, due to the coring and cutting and cost of the installation and the cost of upgrading the electric supply and everything, could be as much as $350,000. Next slide, please. And this is the network that we ended up being able to pay for. It's not a lot, but it's roughly what we only had a little bit of money. It was fairly helpful. You might notice in the blue dots, there are a representative of just level 2 chargers. So those are low levels, but the others are at least 50 kW chargers and some 150s. It was it was a good attempt. And one of the problems we had was that there were several companies that decided they didn't want to do the project after they had applied for it and we had awarded them the funds. So we ended up, let's see, next slide, please. We ended up with over $1 million remaining because of the different companies that backed out of their projects. So looking at our network, we decided that the best thing for us to do would be to designate different locations for charger installation. Instead of saying that you can put it anywhere in the state of Oklahoma, we had certain places where we wanted people to locate the chargers to try to fill in the different charging different locations. Next slide, please. So this was what we came up with as far as designated locations where we wanted to locate chargers. And it would, we only had a little bit over $1 million, so it would only go so far. we accepted applications, and unfortunately, we didn't receive applications for several of the locations. So we had troubles, trying to fill in those gaps, but with the funds that we're going to be receiving from the federal government here fairly soon, hopefully we'll be able to fill that in. Next slide, please. And this is a map of the locations that we ended up being able to locate chargers. It helped to fill it in a little bit, but we still have a ways to go. And next slide, please. That is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, you feel free to send an email to the VW settlement at deq.ok.gov, and I could answer that for you. That's it.
Thanks, Leon. We do have a question in the chat on what kind of utilization you are seeing at the stations you've installed.
I received a report recently, and the utilization, it's, I think, when COVID hit, it kind of went down some, I believe, but there's a decent amount. It's hard to, I would say some of them, apparently several in different locations would probably have maybe a car there charging up maybe every 2 or 3 days, something like that. Some of the locations are more used than others, but I think some of it is a lot of people. If you're not able to go out and mingle, it's kind of hard to take a trip and go anywhere. You need to stop and eat somewhere and all this. And if you can't do that, then it's really hard to take a trip. And for the most part, the people who with electric vehicles, a good 95% or more of their charging is at their house because it's cheaper, easier to do. They can charge it overnight. The level 3 chargers are really for I'm on the road and I need to get from one location to another. And I would like to say, whenever you work with someone as far as putting chargers in, we had one convenience store owner to apply for several chargers along turnpikes in Oklahoma. And he applied and was wanting to put in 2 level 2 chargers and a 50 kW level 3, and that was it. And fortunately, another company in Oklahoma who kind of specialized in in installing chargers talked to him, and we all agreed that we would transfer the projects to them, and they ended up putting in 3 200 kW chargers, which makes a lot more sense along an interstate or a turnpike. People don't want to sit there for forever waiting for the car to charge.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the additional information. And I know there's been a lot of private sector investment in Oklahoma. We'll have to hear more about. We did get some additional questions, but I think we'll hold those to the end. So a big thanks. And we'll turn it over to Angela for our final presentation from the state of Virginia. Angela?
Yes, thanks, Cassie. And geez, wow, that's really some great work being done by Michigan and Oklahoma. So yeah, very interesting work. So let's talk about what Virginia has been doing in deploying light duty infrastructure, public infrastructure in the Commonwealth in the context of the Volkswagen mitigation settlement. So next slide, please. All right, so we're basically going to talk about what the approach or the vehicle was and still is in terms of deploying infrastructure, light duty infrastructure in the Volkswagen settlement. What has been the key benefits and outcomes of that approach to date, and some of the key challenges and lessons learned along the way. So I'm going to take us back in time a bit. So we're going to go back to 2017 when the planning effort for this approach got underway. So this was a planning effort that included the Secretaries of Transportation, Natural Resources, and Labor and Commerce, and their agencies. And so when we are looking back in late 17 and early 2018, there was very little fast charging infrastructure in the ground in the Commonwealth of Virginia at that time. And what was actually in the ground in Virginia was very concentrated in the Northern Virginia area. So this planning group of the secretaries and the agencies landed on a competitive RFP process. So, you know, to expedite the build out of infrastructure across the state and in a strategic approach, they felt that a carefully crafted competitive RFP process would be the best way to build out a statewide public charging infrastructure in the Commonwealth. And so the Department of Environmental Quality, as the lead agency for the Volkswagen mitigation settlement, was charged with crafting that RFP with input from other state agencies. And so what we did was we crafted an RFP that was looking for a turnkey solution. And when I talk about a turnkey solution, we're talking about, we were looking for an EVSE provider who was going to help with siting, who had host site experience in siting those chargers, who had lots of experience working with utilities and permitting offices. They were going to own and operate the charging infrastructure in the Commonwealth as well. So they needed to have experience owning and operating fast charging as well. And so we put together this RFP process. And so they had requirements to build in 6 primary geographic areas across the state, to identify and obtain host sites agreements. We're going to have a three-year build out cycle. They would own and operate these chargers for a minimum of 5 years. We had a 45% small business requirement in the RFP. We had performance targets for the network of a net network uptime of 95%. We were looking for a redundancy at each site. We were looking for future proofing of each site. There were equity concerns, and there were other targets set for building out this network, including that 95% of all Virginians would be within 30 miles of a public charger when this network under this particular contract was completed. And there were other requirements. Those are the highlights. So there were several members from the State Energy Office along with DEQ. We had that were on the RFP evaluation committee. We had a very long vetting and negotiation period under the RFP process. And so eventually we landed on and awarded a contract to EVgo in the fall of 2018. This was a 3-year contract with 2-year option years. And since awarding that contract in 2018 to EVgo, we've actually modified that contract three times since 2018. And so some of the benefits and outcomes of this approach where we were able to leverage tremendous expertise, and also we were able to build out quite quickly. This turnkey solution, EVgo had lots of experience working with host sites, obtaining host sites agreements. They had lots of utility experience. They had lots of permitting experience. and they also had lots of experience owning and operating chargers. This approach also gave us tremendous flexibility, which is needed. This is a quickly evolving space, and so you need to be able to make adjustments to your build plan. And so we were able to make those adjustments to the build plan. And we had lots of good information about other large building infrastructure build outs in the Commonwealth. And so we would change some of the siting approach based on where we were seeing, other infrastructure being concentrated and built out. So there was tremendous flexibility in this approach. We also were able to, we're leveraging a great deal of private sector capital. And I said earlier, we talked about the target of this 45% of the work to be small minority and women-owned businesses. So we're currently actually at 60% of that, of the spend of this contract is going to small businesses within the Commonwealth. We are already currently at the target of 95% of all Virginians are within 30 miles of a public charger. And right now we're at 93% of Virginians within 30 miles of a public fast charger. Those stats are a little bit dated. And so we are likely closer to the 95% of Virginians within a public fast charger. That is a great project that has been farmed out to graduate students at UNC Chapel Hill who are doing that calculation for the Commonwealth. So in addition to that, right? So in addition to this 30 miles, this target of 95% Virginians within 30 miles of a public fast charger is just another way that we've been able to address and manage range anxiety, equity and access, right? So we have, 95% of Virginians are within 30 miles of a charger, and 30 miles of 93% right now within proximity of a fast charger. There are also, EVgo also has environmental justice site selection criteria built into its site selection process. We also look at building in terms of access and equity, proximity to multi-unit dwelling and to ride share hubs as well. So where are we at? So the initial build plan, we're building out 80 plus sites. We're putting 50 kW and 150 kW chargers in the ground. And we are adjusting again to put 350 kW chargers in the ground in the third deployment phase. We currently have 136 chargers that are operational at 43 host sites across the Commonwealth. We have another 10 charging sites that are in construction or where construction is complete or in permitting. 70% of the remaining sites that we have executed host sites agreements, excuse me. And we are also under this agreement. We've given out donated 25 kW chargers to cities, towns, and public universities and community colleges. So again, we've been able to leverage tremendous expertise. It's been a strategic deployment process. We're building out in all of these 6 primary geographic areas. We're really getting, so we're getting infrastructure and geographic diversity across the Commonwealth in what we're doing in this approach. So some of the key challenges and lessons learned to date, there are many, but if I had to land on one, I think one of the biggest challenges that we've had is really balancing public and private sector needs. And so an example of that is being very prescriptive in our requirements versus being less prescriptive, and balancing both those needs, what we need as public entities and stewards of the Volkswagen dollars, and making sure that public access is met and that we have geographic diversity So it's been a balancing act. Some of the other stuff that we've looked like, that we've learned is that you know, the importance of using money for operation and maintenance, especially when you're looking at siting infrastructure in rural areas, and you know, where utilization or that you know, the charger may not be used, or if it's used, it may be used once a week. So it's important to think about in this, in what states are doing, is allowing for the use of money for O&M. And then we have ran into some issues with this approach, in being able to site infrastructure on public property. There has been some issues in terms of looking, you know, procurement related issues, and also the ability of, you know, we've ran into some indemnification issues as well. But overall, this has been an approach that has served the Commonwealth well, and we feel like we're in a really good position to be working with our Virginia Department of Transportation and our state energy office as we plan for building out additional infrastructure in the Commonwealth with the funding that will be coming through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So, Cassie, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Angela. Appreciate that. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. Angela, one for you is that there are EV intercity bus technologies in use worldwide, and based on your experience with passenger vehicle charging, how would you, or how could intercity network charging be built in? Could it just be added to the selection criteria?
Cassie, can you read that question again? I'm sorry, I missed the inner what?
The intercity, and so buses used within a city. I think that the spirit of the question is just whether or not you could, you know, really try to prioritize medium and heavy duty infrastructure build out in addition to the passenger build out.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, that's not been the focus of this this network. So the focus was in the, you know, has been on light duty. And so I think that's definitely an option. But you're looking really at two very different light duty versus medium and heavy duty. So there's different siting criteria for where light duties are rolling, you know, where light duty vehicles are traveling. I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity to have strategic places along corridors where, you know, trucks and buses, or, you know, I know this is intercity, right? So, but still, you know, so bus depots and light duty vehicles, you know, I mean, if you want to integrate that type of infrastructure, you know, I do think that probably intercity transit buses are they're going to need their depots, and they're going to need charging along the routes. And so certainly, you know, I don't know about the integration of the two.
Absolutely. We do have a couple of questions, first for Angela and then for Robert, really related to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. First for Angela, do you expect a similar approach in terms of choosing a single provider for EV chargers for distributing the formula funds coming out of the Infrastructure Act or other charging infrastructure funds?
Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know that will be the approach. I seriously doubt that will be the. It may be a approach. It certainly won't be the only approach, and it's not. You know, it's likely not appropriate for every use case that we're going to be seeing under the Infrastructure Act. So that's really and so it's really premature for me to really comment on. But you know, it's a approach that we have experience with, and it may be one of the approaches. It certainly will not be the only approach.
Got it. Thank you. And for Robert, we have a question about funding source. And so the question is about kind of the affordability of the network in Michigan, and was your funding source for the network determined before the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was announced?
Yes and no. So the bare bones system was determined before the infrastructure bill was passed. The only funds that we had at that time was the Volkswagen settlement money and monies that were and funds that were allowed to the investment on utilities through the approval of the Public Service Commission. Hence why we looked at the Volkswagen funds we had, how much we could allocate, plus some additional funds, including the SEP money that we had. And then using the one third enabled us to completely build, to finance the bare bones system. So a third of it came from utilities, a third came from private sector or the host site, and a third came from the state through the Volkswagen settlement. Now, since then, because the program has, this model is working in the utilities and the private sector, like the shared investment and shared liability, we have received small appropriations to continue to build out. For example, we received a small appropriation to build the charging stations for the Lake Michigan circuit. That was not part of the Volkswagen settlement. That was part of an appropriation that we received and funding that we had also received from our Department of Transportation. Now, the greater build out that will come from the Jobs Act, and we're busy doing the modeling now to specify what areas of the state that we need to focus on and building out in placement of those charging stations and the number of charging stations that were needed to support EV travels. I should point this one thing out. Most states, and I'm not thinking, we just decided we'll do it a different way. When you look at the build out of EV charging stations, is based upon the number of EVs owned within a state. And that's really a good approach to take. Our approach, however, is a little bit different. We're looking at the number of trips taken in an EV and the number of miles taken in an EV. When you look at statistics now, about 5,000, an EV driver will drive their vehicle 5,000 miles a year. That's nothing compared to someone who has a internal combustion engine vehicle. They're going to drive anywhere between 10 to 15,000 miles per year. And we're trying to get to parity. And the reason why we're not getting any traction or driving EVs beyond the 5,000 is because there's no infrastructure. Now, when I say that 5,000 miles, I mean for battery EVs. I'm not talking about hybrids. Hybrid drivers that will drive that vehicle for 10, 15, and some I've seen drive 20,000 miles per year. But I'm talking about for pure battery vehicles, it's 5,000. We need to get still the confidence and build an infrastructure to enable these vehicles to be driven anywhere between 10 and 15,000 miles per year. And when you look at it from that perspective, then the number of cars that are being purchased is not important. It's the number of trips that you need to be able to fuel in order to charge in order to enable that kind of driving an electric vehicle. And then once you've done that, then you get greater adoption of electric vehicles, not only in light duty, but also in medium.
Great. Thank you, Robert. And thank you to all of our speakers for joining us. We are just about at time. I did want to make just a couple of announcements before we close. First of all, we will have a third and final webinar in this series next Wednesday, February 2nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be sharing registration links with this group, and this will focus on stakeholder engagement strategies with comments from South Carolina and from Oregon. So continuing on our theme of models from state offices. Beyond that, also, many of you likely will have received a request for information that was issued by NASEO last week. We are building an online repository of documents that states can use during their EV infrastructure build out under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This online clearinghouse is set to be launched in mid-February, around the same time that the federal guidance on the national EV formula is set be launched. And we are asking for states to send in program documents that they have found helpful when creating previous EV infrastructure programs, RFPs, contracts, proposals, budgetary documents, etc. These will all go onto this password protected website for states that they'll be able to access, again, to help them with their infrastructure planning. And so check your email for that, and please contact me or Dylan with any questions. And I just want to again say a thank you to our speakers, to Leon, to Robert, and to Angela for joining us. And thank you all for making time. Have a good day.